My best friend kept flirting with me for months. When I finally confessed, he laughed in my face and said I was delusional. So I'd been best friends with Ryan since the sophomore year of college, when we got paired up for a chemistry project. We just clicked immediately, and spent the next 4 years basically attached at the hip. After graduation, we both got jobs in the same city and kept hanging out constantly. Everything was totally platonic until about 8 months ago, when Ryan started acting differently. It started with him texting me good morning every single day with heart emojis. Then he'd constantly find excuses to touch me, like fixing my hair or putting his hand on my lower back when we walked through doors. He started calling me beautiful instead of dude, and would get weird when other guys talked to me at bars. When we'd watch movies at his place, he'd pull me close and play with my hair for hours. One time, he literally traced circles on my thigh for an entire episode of a show, and when I looked at him, he just smiled and kept going. My roommate Jess said he was obviously into me, but I kept making excuses because I didn't want to ruin the friendship if I was reading it wrong. But then Ryan escalated things even more. He started buying me random gifts like jewelry and expensive perfume. He'd plan these elaborate hangouts that were basically dates, complete with reservations at romantic restaurants where he'd insist on paying. He drunk called me one night at 2 a.m. saying he missed my voice and needed to hear it before he could sleep. Another time we were at a party, and he told everyone I was the most important person in his life while staring straight at me. He even introduced me to his new co-workers as his girl, before quickly correcting himself. The final straw was when he showed up at my apartment with flowers after I had a bad day at work, held me for 20 minutes, and whispered that everything would be okay, because he'd always take care of me. That night, I decided I had to tell him how I felt, because the signals were so obvious even my Uber driver commented on how in love my boyfriend seemed. I planned it all out, invited Ryan over for dinner at my place, and made his favorite food. After we ate, I sat him down and told him I'd developed feelings for him, and wanted to know if he felt the same way since he'd been acting like he did for months. Ryan literally burst out laughing. Not nervous laughter, but actual belly laughing like I'd told the funniest joke ever. He said I must be confused because he was just being a good friend, and that I'd completely misread everything. He actually used the word delusional. Then he said he thought of me like a little sister, and the idea of us together was hilarious and kind of gross. He kept laughing as he explained that the touching and gifts were just him being friendly, and I shouldn't assume every guy who's nice wants to date me. He left still chuckling about how awkward I'd made things. I cried for 2 days straight. Jess had to call in sick for me because I couldn't function. But then I got angry. Really angry. Because you don't act like that with someone you see as a sister. So I decided to show Ryan exactly what he'd thrown away. First, I completely cut contact. No explanation, no dramatic goodbye. Just stopped responding to everything. Ryan texted asking if I was okay, and I left him on read. He called 6 times that first week, and I ignored every single one. He even showed up at my apartment, but I had Jess tell him I wasn't home even though my car was right there. While Ryan was freaking out about losing his best friend, I started living my absolute best life. I joined a boxing gym and got in the best shape ever. I started wearing the clothes I'd always been too self-conscious to wear. I got that promotion I'd been working toward and started making bank. But the real kicker was when I started dating Alex from my gym. Alex was everything Ryan pretended not to be. Gorgeous, successful, and completely obsessed with me in the most genuine way. He'd post about me constantly, calling me his dream girl. We'd go to all the places Ryan and I used to hang out, and people would comment on what a perfect couple we were. Ryan started seeing it all through mutual friends' social media and lost his mind. He tried reaching out through our friend group, saying he missed me and didn't understand what happened. Our mutual friend Kevin told me Ryan kept asking about Alex and whether I was really happy. Then Ryan started showing up at places he knew I'd be. The coffee shop I went to every Saturday, the bookstore I loved, and even my gym, until they told him he needed a membership to keep hanging around. Each time he'd try to approach, and I'd act like he was invisible while Alex held me closer. The breaking point for Ryan was when we all ended up at the same house party. Alex and I showed up looking incredible, and Ryan watched me be happier than I'd ever been with him. When Alex went to get drinks, Ryan cornered me and said he'd made a mistake, and realized he did have feelings for me. He said seeing me with someone else made him understand what he'd lost. He actually tried to grab my hand and said we could start over. I looked him dead in the eye and laughed. I looked him dead in the eye and laughed. The sound came out sharper than I expected, almost mean, and I watched his face go from hopeful to confused to hurt in about 3 seconds. He stepped back like I'd slapped him, his hand dropping from where he'd been reaching for mine. I turned away and walked back to Alex without another word, leaving Ryan standing there alone while people pretended not to stare. The drive home felt amazing. Alex kept his hand on my thigh while I replayed the moment over and over in my head, how Ryan's face had crumpled when I laughed, how he'd looked so small and desperate. I told Alex every detail and he said I handled it perfectly, that Ryan deserved exactly what he got after humiliating me like that. We got back to my apartment and I couldn't stop talking about it, describing Ryan's expression again and again, while Alex held me and agreed that the whole thing was perfect revenge. But 3 days later, something felt off. I kept checking my phone expecting Ryan to text, refreshing his Instagram to see if he'd posted anything about the party. He hadn't posted at all, actually, which was weird because Ryan posted constantly. I found myself scrolling back through his old photos, looking at pictures of us together from months ago, zooming in on his face to see if I could read something I'd missed. Alex came over Tuesday night and caught me staring at a photo of Ryan and me at the beach from last summer. He asked what I was doing, and I locked my phone fast, said I was just scrolling randomly. He didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Thursday morning, I woke up to 17 texts from Ryan. The first one came in at 2 a.m., a long message saying he was sorry for everything, and he understood if I hated him, but could we please just talk? The messages got longer as the night went on, him explaining that he'd been thinking about what happened and he realized he'd made a huge mistake. He said watching me with Alex made him understand what he'd thrown away. He kept saying he wanted to explain, that there was so much I didn't understand about why he'd reacted the way he did when I confessed. I screenshot every single message and sent them to Jess with crying, laughing emojis. I added comments like, "Look at him begging, and this is so pathetic." I expected her to laugh with me, to say Ryan was finally getting what he deserved. Instead, she just responded asking if I was okay. I typed back that I was great, better than ever, why wouldn't I be okay? She sent back 3 dots for like a full minute before finally saying, "Are you really okay? Or are you just performing being okay for me?" The question pissed me off more than it should have. I didn't respond for the rest of the day. More texts came from Ryan on Friday, then Saturday. Each one longer than the last. Him apologizing and asking to meet up, saying he missed me and our friendship meant everything to him. I kept screenshotting them but stopped sending them to Jess after her weird response. Instead, I just read them over and over, analyzing every word, trying to figure out if he actually meant any of it, or if this was just more manipulation. Sunday night, Alex stayed over and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Ryan's messages, wondering what he wanted to explain, what I supposedly didn't understand. Around 2 in the morning, I grabbed my phone off the nightstand as quietly as I could and opened Instagram. I scrolled through Ryan's profile again, looking at every photo, reading old captions. I didn't even realize how long I'd been doing it until Alex's voice made me jump. He asked what I was doing and I tried to close the app fast, but he'd already seen. He sat up in bed and turned on the lamp, squinting at me in the sudden light. He asked point blank if I was actually over Ryan or if I was just using him to make Ryan jealous. I got defensive immediately, telling him that was ridiculous and of course I cared about him. I said Ryan was ancient history and I was just checking to see if he'd posted anything crazy after the party. Alex didn't look away from my face, just kept staring at me with this sad expression that made my stomach hurt. He said I'd been different since the party, more distracted, always on my phone. He asked how many times I'd checked Ryan's Instagram since we started dating. I told him I didn't know, maybe a few times. It wasn't a big deal. He said he'd watched me do it at least twice a day for the past week alone. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out because I couldn't actually remember how often I'd been checking. Alex reached over and took my hand, asked me again if I was really over Ryan, or if this whole relationship was just about making him jealous. I insisted I genuinely cared about Alex, that Ryan was just background noise now, that the party proved I'd moved on. But even as I said it, I couldn't quite meet his eyes. Part of me knew he was right. Part of me had been waiting this whole time for Ryan to realize what he'd lost, and now that it was happening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Alex squeezed my hand and said he wanted to believe me, but he needed me to be honest with myself about what I actually wanted. I promised him I was being honest, but my voice came out wrong, too high and too defensive. He turned off the lamp without saying anything else, and we both just lay there in the dark, not touching. Monday afternoon, Maya texted the group chat saying she was having people over for dinner Saturday and everyone should come. She added that this included both me and Ryan because she was tired of managing drama, and we were all adults who could handle being in the same room. I stared at the message for a solid 5 minutes trying to figure out how to get out of it. But if I said no, it would look like I wasn't actually over everything. Like seeing Ryan still bothered me. So I responded that I'd be there and I'd bring Alex. The week dragged by. I kept checking to see if Ryan had responded to Maya's invitation, but the group chat stayed quiet. Wednesday, he texted me directly again. Another long message about how he'd been doing a lot of thinking, and really needed to talk to me in person. I left it on read. Thursday, he sent a shorter message, just saying please. I almost responded, but then remembered his face when he'd laughed at my confession, and deleted the text I'd started typing. Saturday night, Alex and I showed up at Maya's apartment right on time. Ryan was already there, sitting on the couch talking to Maya's boyfriend. He looked up when we walked in, and his whole face changed, going from relaxed to tense in a second. I grabbed Alex's hand tighter and walked past Ryan without looking at him directly. Maya came over and hugged us both, whispering that she appreciated us being mature about this. I wanted to tell her there was nothing mature about forcing us into the same room, but I just smiled and said it was fine. Dinner was awkward as hell. Maya had set the table, so Ryan was directly across from me, probably hoping we'd be forced to interact. Instead, I spent the whole meal talking to Alex and the people on either side of me, laughing extra loud at jokes that weren't that funny, touching Alex's arm constantly. I could feel Ryan watching me, but I never looked directly at him. Luke kept glancing between us with this expression I couldn't read. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to refill my drink. Luke followed me in and closed the door behind him. He leaned against the counter and asked if I was proud of myself. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said everyone knew exactly what I was doing, parading Alex around specifically to hurt Ryan, making sure Ryan saw how happy I was without him. I told Luke that Ryan had humiliated me, and he deserved to see me doing better. Luke shook his head and said I wasn't doing better. I was being cruel to someone who'd been my best friend for years. He said the whole friend group was uncomfortable watching me weaponize Alex in our social circle just to get revenge. He asked why I needed revenge this badly, why I couldn't just move on like an actual adult. I felt my face get hot and told Luke he had no idea what Ryan had done to me, how he'd led me on for months and then laughed in my face. Luke said he knew all that and Ryan had been wrong, but that didn't make what I was doing now any less manipulative. He said watching me had made him realize I was capable of being just as cruel as Ryan when I wanted to be. I left the kitchen without responding, grabbed Alex and told him we needed to go. The next week, I threw myself into work like my life depended on it. I stayed late every night, volunteered for extra projects, responded to emails at midnight. My boss noticed and pulled me aside Wednesday to say she was impressed with my initiative. Thursday, I landed a huge client that the senior team had been trying to get for months. They actually called a meeting to congratulate me, and my boss mentioned that if I kept performing at this level, another promotion might be coming sooner than expected. For a few days, I felt like myself again. Not the version of me that was obsessed with Ryan or performing happiness for revenge, but the actual me who worked hard and was good at her job. I realized I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be proud of something that had nothing to do with making Ryan regret losing me. The accomplishment felt real in a way that laughing in Ryan's face hadn't. It was mine. Something I'd earned. Not just a reaction to someone else's actions. Friday night, Alex took me out to celebrate the work win. We went to this nice restaurant downtown and he ordered champagne. For the first hour, everything felt normal and good. Like we were an actual couple celebrating an actual achievement. But halfway through the main course, Alex put down his fork and said we needed to talk. My stomach dropped because nothing good ever follows those words. He said he needed to know whether this relationship was real or just convenient timing. I started to protest, but he held up his hand and kept talking. He said he'd known from the start that I was rebounding hard and using him to make someone jealous. But he'd gone along with it hoping I'd eventually actually see him as a person instead of a tool. He said it had been months now, and he still wasn't sure I actually cared about him, or if he was just a prop in my revenge story. I told him of course I cared about him, that he was important to me, that this was real. But even as I said it, I could hear how hollow it sounded. Alex looked at me sadly and said he needed to know if that was ever going to be actually true, or if I was always going to be thinking about Ryan while I was with him. He said he deserved better than being someone's revenge fantasy, and honestly, so did I. The champagne suddenly tasted sour in my mouth. I woke up Saturday morning to Jess sitting on the edge of my bed holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and said we needed to talk, that she couldn't keep doing this. I asked what she meant and she said she'd been covering for me, telling people I was fine when I clearly wasn't, and she couldn't keep watching me destroy myself over someone who didn't deserve this much of my energy. She pulled out her phone and showed me my own location history from Find My Friends. I'd been checking Ryan's location 47 times on Thursday alone. She said I'd been engineering situations to run into him, timing my gym visits to match his schedule, going to the coffee shop at exactly the times I knew he'd be there. She said I talked about him constantly even when I claimed to be over it, that every conversation somehow circled back to Ryan and what he'd done and how he must be feeling now. Jess said she was genuinely worried about me, that this obsession wasn't healthy and it was affecting everything in my life. She mentioned that Alex had texted her asking if I was okay, that my boss had called her once when I didn't show up for a meeting because I'd been sitting in my car outside Ryan's apartment building. I didn't even remember missing that meeting. Jess squeezed my hand and said she loved me, but I needed to actually deal with what happened instead of turning my entire life into a revenge mission. Tuesday afternoon, I got home from work to find a letter in my mailbox. Handwritten, my name on the envelope in Ryan's messy scrawl. I sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at it before I finally opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, his handwriting getting messier as it went like he'd been writing fast to get everything out. He wrote that he'd panicked when I confessed because he was scared of losing me as a friend. He said he'd convinced himself that rejection was safer than risking the most important relationship in his life. He explained that he'd been in therapy for 6 weeks trying to understand why he sabotages emotional closeness, why he pushes away people he cares about. His therapist had helped him realize he had serious problems with emotional vulnerability that went back to his parents' divorce when he was 12. The letter said he knew now that laughing at me was the cruelest possible response to someone he actually cared about deeply. He wrote that he'd been replaying that moment for months, seeing my face when he laughed, and he understood why I hated him. He said he was sorry for the damage he'd caused and he didn't expect me to forgive him, but he needed me to know that his rejection had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own fear of being vulnerable with someone who actually mattered. I read the letter 5 times sitting in my car. Then I went inside and read it 3 more times. I didn't know what to feel about it. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, to stay angry because anger felt safer than whatever complicated mess of emotions was trying to surface. But another part of me recognized something real in his words, something vulnerable that felt different from his desperate texts. Wednesday night, someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened it to find Dexter standing there looking uncomfortable. He said Ryan had asked him not to come, but he felt like I should know some things. He came in and sat on my couch, fidgeting with his keys while he talked. Dexter said Ryan had been going to therapy twice a week and doing actual work on his fear of emotional vulnerability and abandonment issues. He said Ryan's therapist had helped him understand that he'd been using the best friend label as protection against having to be honest about romantic feelings. Dexter explained that watching me with Alex had finally made Ryan understand what he'd thrown away. But more than that, it had forced him to confront why he kept sabotaging relationships before they could become real. Dexter looked at me seriously and said he thought I should know that Ryan was actually changing, not just performing regret to get me back. He said Ryan had been working through some really difficult stuff about his parents, and his fear of abandonment, and his pattern of pushing people away when they got too close. Dexter added that he wasn't saying I owed Ryan anything, but he thought I deserved to know the full picture of what was happening. After Dexter left, I sat on my couch feeling completely overwhelmed. Everything felt complicated in ways I didn't want to deal with. I'd been so focused on revenge and making Ryan regret what he'd done that I hadn't actually processed any of my own feelings about it. I'd just turned all that hurt into anger and used it as fuel to hurt him back. Friday morning, Alex texted asking me to meet him for coffee. I knew what was coming before I even got there. He was already sitting at a table when I arrived, 2 cups in front of him. He pushed one toward me and said he'd been thinking a lot about our conversation at dinner. He said he needed to know within a week if I could actually be present in this relationship, or if I was still emotionally consumed by Ryan. He said he wasn't angry, just tired of being the person I was with while thinking about someone else. He said he deserved better than being someone's revenge fantasy or rebound safety net. Then he looked at me and said, honestly, I deserved better too. That I deserved to actually deal with what happened instead of using him as a shield against my own feelings. He said he'd give me a week to figure out what I actually wanted, but after that, he needed a real answer about whether this relationship had any chance of being genuine. I walked home from the coffee shop feeling like everything was falling apart. My perfect revenge plan had somehow turned into this mess where I'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it, alienated my friends, and still couldn't stop thinking about Ryan despite everything. I'd been so sure that making him regret losing me would fix everything, but instead it had just made everything more complicated and painful. The weekend dragged by in this weird fog where I kept replaying Alex's ultimatum in my head. I showed up to work Monday morning determined to prove I still had my priorities straight, that the Ryan situation hadn't completely taken over my life the way everyone seemed to think. I grabbed coffee from the break room and headed to my desk, ready to tackle the presentation I'd been putting off. But when I opened my laptop, I saw 3 emails from clients asking about deliverables I'd completely forgotten about. My stomach dropped. I'd missed 2 deadlines last week and hadn't even noticed. I started frantically typing responses, trying to come up with explanations that didn't sound like excuses, when I heard footsteps behind me. My mentor Sarah stood there with this concerned look on her face that made me want to crawl under my desk. She asked if I had a minute to talk in her office. I followed her down the hallway, feeling like I was walking to my own execution. She closed the door behind us and sat down, and I could tell from her expression this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. She said my performance had noticeably declined over the past 2 weeks. I'd missed deadlines that weren't like me at all. She was concerned because I'd worked so hard for the promotion opportunity we'd discussed last month, but I seemed really distracted lately. Was everything okay at home? The question hit me like a punch to the gut because I realized she was right. The Ryan drama had completely bled into the one part of my life I'd been so proud of. The professional success I'd earned through actual effort, not spite or revenge or trying to make someone jealous. I'd been so focused on making Ryan regret losing me that I was actively destroying something I'd built myself. I mumbled something about personal issues I was dealing with and promised to get back on track. Sarah nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She said she needed those client deliverables by end of day Wednesday, and we'd revisit the promotion discussion in a few weeks once she saw consistent performance again. I walked back to my desk feeling sick. I spent the rest of the day working like crazy, skipping lunch to catch up on everything I'd let slide. By the time I left the office at 8 that night, I'd made progress, but I kept thinking about how close I'd come to throwing away something that actually mattered. Something that had nothing to do with Ryan or Alex or proving anything to anyone. Maya's birthday party was that Friday, and I seriously considered not going. The thought of seeing Ryan again, of maintaining polite small talk while our entire friend group watched us nervously, made me want to fake being sick. But Maya had been my friend since sophomore year, and skipping her birthday because of boy drama felt pathetic. So I showed up at her apartment with a bottle of wine and a smile I didn't feel. Ryan was already there when I arrived. He was standing in the kitchen talking to Luke, and the second I walked in, the conversation stopped. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. I walked over to Maya and gave her a hug, handing her the wine. She squeezed me extra tight and whispered that she was glad I came. Ryan and I maintained this stiff politeness for the next 2 hours. We said hello when I arrived. We stood in the same conversation circle for a while talking about Maya's new job. We even laughed at the same joke someone told. But it was exhausting. The energy in the room felt wrong, like everyone was waiting for something to explode. I left early around 10, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie. I said goodbye to Maya and headed for the door. I was halfway down the hallway to the elevator when I heard footsteps behind me. Ryan called my name. I stopped but didn't turn around. He caught up and stood there looking uncomfortable. He asked if we could please just talk like adults. He said he knew I was mad and I had every right to be, but this tension was killing him and clearly affecting our friends too. He suggested coffee later that week, somewhere neutral where we could actually have a real conversation. I was so tired of the whole thing. Tired of performing anger, tired of avoiding him, tired of everyone watching us like we were characters in some drama they were all invested in. And maybe part of me still missed my best friend despite everything that had happened. So I agreed to coffee on Tuesday afternoon at that place near his office. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. Ryan went back inside and I heard the apartment door close behind him. I stood there waiting for the elevator, checking my phone to call a rideshare. Maya's apartment was on the 3rd floor and her living room window was open because it was warm that night. I could hear voices drifting down from above. Ryan's voice carried clearly. He was talking to Luke about me. I froze on the sidewalk, my finger hovering over the rideshare app. Ryan said I had every right to be angry at him. He told Luke he deserved the public humiliation because of how cruel his rejection had been. He said watching me happy with someone else hurt, but it wasn't about what he deserved. It was about what I deserved after he'd treated me so badly. His voice cracked a little when he said it. Luke said something I couldn't make out. Ryan responded that he'd been a coward and a jerk, and I'd been his best friend, and he'd thrown that away because he was too scared to be honest. I stood there on the sidewalk feeling things I absolutely did not want to feel about someone I was supposed to hate. The rideshare notification buzzed in my hand, but I couldn't move. Alex came over the next night. I'd been dreading it all day because I knew what was coming. He showed up at 7 with Thai food, and this calm expression that somehow made everything worse. We ate in near silence. He asked about my day, and I told him about the work situation. He listened and nodded, but I could tell he was working up to something. After we finished eating, he put down his fork and looked at me directly. He said he'd known the whole time that I was using him for revenge. My friend Jess had accidentally let it slip at the gym weeks ago. He'd stayed anyway because he hoped I'd eventually see him as a real person instead of a tool. But he was realizing now that I wasn't capable of that yet. He needed to respect himself enough to walk away from someone who was emotionally unavailable, even if he had real feelings for me. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out because he was completely right. He said he deserved better than being a prop in my revenge fantasy, and honestly, I deserved better too. I deserved to actually deal with what happened instead of using him as a shield. He stood up and grabbed his jacket. He said he hoped I figured things out, but he couldn't wait around anymore while I worked through my Ryan issues. He left quietly. No dramatic door slam, no yelling, just gone. I made it to the bathroom before I completely fell apart. I sat down on the tile floor and started hyperventilating. My chest felt tight and my hands were shaking. I suddenly saw myself clearly for the first time in months. I'd manipulated a genuinely good person the exact same way Ryan had manipulated me with mixed signals and false hope. I'd used Alex's feelings to hurt someone else. I'd turned him into a weapon. The realization that I'd become exactly what I hated in Ryan made me physically sick. I leaned over the toilet, but nothing came out. I just sat there on the bathroom floor crying and gasping for air. I spent an hour there confronting the fact that being hurt doesn't justify hurting other people on purpose. That revenge doesn't actually fix anything. That I'd wasted months of my life obsessing over making one person regret their choices while actively becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone mean and calculating and willing to use people. The bathroom tiles were cold against my legs and I couldn't stop shaking. Jess found me there around 11. She'd let herself in with her spare key when I didn't answer her texts. She sat down on the floor next to me without saying anything and just held me while I cried. The next morning, she staged a full intervention. She'd invited Maya over and they both sat on my couch looking serious. Jess said I'd been obsessively focused on Ryan for months in an unhealthy way that was affecting every part of my life. Maya said the friend group had been worried but didn't know how to help. They'd watched me weaponize my relationship with Alex and create tension at every social gathering. Jess said I needed to deal with the actual hurt instead of performing revenge. This behavior wasn't who I really was, and they missed their friend who had interests beyond making one guy regret his choices. Maya added that several people in our friend group had been uncomfortable, but nobody knew how to call it out without seeming unsupportive. They both looked at me with this mix of concern and frustration. I sat there feeling exposed and ashamed because everything they said was true. I texted Alex that afternoon asking to meet. He agreed to coffee the next day. I showed up early and rehearsed what I wanted to say about 50 times in my head. When he arrived, I apologized with complete honesty. I told him I'd used him and hadn't seen him as a real person with feelings beyond how he made Ryan jealous. I said I understood if he never wanted to speak to me again, but I needed him to know I recognized what I'd done was wrong and manipulative. He deserved so much better than being a prop in my revenge fantasy. I was genuinely sorry for the hurt I'd caused while claiming to be the victim. Alex listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he appreciated the apology. He asked if I'd figured out what I actually wanted yet, or if I was still stuck on Ryan. I told him honestly I didn't know. He nodded and said he respected that I was at least being real now. He said maybe we could be friends eventually. but he needed space first. We left the coffee shop going separate directions. Tuesday afternoon, I met Ryan at the cafe near his office. We sat across from each other in a back booth and had the most honest conversation we'd ever had. He told me about his therapy work on attachment issues and fear of being left behind. He explained how his parents' divorce when he was 12 had messed him up in ways he hadn't understood until recently. He said his therapist helped him see that he pushed people away when they got too close because he was scared of being abandoned. The laughing when I confessed had been a panic response, a way to reject me before I could reject him. I listened and then admitted I'd weaponized Alex specifically to hurt him. I'd used social situations to make him jealous. I'd been cruel on purpose because I wanted him to feel as bad as he'd made me feel. We both sat with the uncomfortable truth that we'd been best friends who didn't actually know how to be emotionally honest with each other about anything that mattered. We'd spent years being close but never vulnerable. Ryan said he was sorry for how he'd handled everything. I said I was sorry too. We agreed we'd hurt each other badly, and maybe that meant we couldn't go back to what we were before. I spent the next week reaching out individually to friends in our group. I called Luke first and apologized for making him uncomfortable and weaponizing social dynamics. I admitted I'd deliberately created tension and forced people to take sides. Luke was still frustrated, but he appreciated the apology. He said he'd been worried about me, but didn't know how to say anything without making things worse. I called Maya next, and she said she was glad I was finally being real about what happened instead of playing victim while actively hurting people. I texted a few other friends with similar apologies. Several of them admitted they hadn't known how to call out my behavior without seeming unsupportive. Everyone seemed relieved I was acknowledging it. The conversations were awkward and uncomfortable, but necessary. 2 weeks later, Alex texted asking to meet again. We got coffee at a different place this time. He said he'd been thinking about everything. He was willing to try dating for real if I could actually be present and honest. He said he'd noticed me working on myself and appreciated that I'd apologized to people I'd hurt. We agreed to start completely over with clear communication and genuine emotional investment. We acknowledged that the first version of our relationship had been built on revenge and performance. But maybe we could build something real now that I'd done the uncomfortable work of confronting my own capacity for manipulation. I told him I couldn't promise I had everything figured out, but I wanted to try for real this time. He smiled and said that was enough for now. We decided to take things slow and actually get to know each other without Ryan's shadow hanging over everything. I texted Ryan a week later asking if he wanted to meet at the park near his apartment, somewhere neutral where we could actually talk without our friends watching or either of us feeling trapped. He showed up looking tired, like he hadn't been sleeping much, and we sat on a bench facing the pond where ducks were swimming in circles. We talked for almost 2 hours about everything we'd never said before, about how our friendship had always felt safe because neither of us had to be fully honest about what we wanted or needed. Ryan admitted he'd used the best friend label as a shield against having to risk real rejection, and I admitted I'd convinced myself his mixed signals were enough because asking for more felt too scary. We both cried a little when we acknowledged that our friendship had been built on a kind of emotional dishonesty that felt comfortable but wasn't actually healthy for either of us. He said his therapist had helped him see that he needed to work on his fear of being vulnerable before he could have any real relationship with anyone, romantic or otherwise. I told him I needed to figure out who I was when I wasn't performing for someone else's approval or trying to make someone regret losing me. We agreed we'd check in maybe once a month, just to see how the other was doing. But we couldn't go back to texting every day or hanging out constantly because that version of closeness had been a lie we both participated in. There was real grief in accepting that some friendships don't survive honesty, but there was also this weird relief in finally telling the truth instead of pretending everything was fine while hiding how we actually felt. 4 months after the party where I'd laughed in Ryan's face, I was sitting in my therapist's office talking about why I'd spent so much energy on revenge instead of just processing the hurt and moving on. Dr. Anderson had helped me see that I'd been seeking validation through making Ryan regret his choices because I didn't actually believe I was worth wanting unless someone else confirmed it through their suffering. Alex and I were dating for real now, taking things slow and actually talking about our feelings instead of just looking good together on social media. We'd deleted the couple's photos from the revenge era and started over with actual honesty about what we both needed from a relationship. I'd thrown myself back into work and gotten that second promotion my boss had mentioned, and I'd started rock climbing on weekends, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for when I was obsessed with the Ryan situation. Some days were still hard though, like when I'd catch myself wanting to check his Instagram or engineer a situation where he'd see me looking happy, and I'd have to actively choose not to do those things. Dr. Anderson kept reminding me that growth wasn't some dramatic moment where everything suddenly clicked into place and I became a completely different person, but rather this ongoing messy process of catching myself falling into old patterns and choosing something different instead.